On the night of October 14, 1858, at Riverside Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, an enslaved preacher named Ezekiel Moore carried out one of the most carefully planned acts of resistance in the history of American slavery. Ezekiel was 43 years old, worked as a traveling preacher who moved from plantation to plantation and lived with a dangerous secret inside him. He was the son of a captured Ashanti griot, and he had mastered ancient oral traditions that could turn spoken words into weapons, sermons into calls for action, and simple stories into detailed plans for rebellion. For 15 long years, he kept this knowledge buried deep, preaching harmless messages beneath the cruelty of the slave-holding South. That changed in March of 1856, when Master Nathaniel Whitfield sold Ezekiel's wife Ruth and their 3 daughters to a slave trader headed to Louisiana. The sale was meant to pay off Whitfield's gambling debts. Ezekiel's family was torn apart forever. In that moment, something inside him shattered beyond repair. The obedient preacher ceased to exist. In his place, a revolutionary prophet was born. For the next 2 years, Ezekiel continued traveling between plantations with his master's permission to preach to enslaved people, but now his sermons carried hidden meanings. In secret hush harbors, in nighttime gatherings deep in the swamps, and in quiet worship meetings inside the slave quarters, he preached coded messages. His words no longer focused on salvation in heaven. They spoke of freedom on earth. Every parable contained instructions. Every spiritual song hid escape routes. Every prayer concealed plans for attack. When the night of October 14, 1858 arrived, 3 coordinate uprisings erupted at the same time across Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. 67 slaveholders, overseers, and patrolmen were killed in planned ambushes. 17 plantations were burned to the ground. More than 200 enslaved people escaped through the Underground Railroad using perfectly timed and organized movements. It took authorities weeks to realize the events were connected. When they finally uncovered the mind behind the chaos, they did not find a soldier holding weapons. They found a preacher armed only with words. Ezekiel Moore became the man no one could silence, the preacher who turned years of sermons into revolution, who proved that words could be deadlier than swords, that faith without action leads to death, but faith combined with strategy leads to freedom. Before understanding how Ezekiel Moore became the most feared preacher in the American South, it is necessary to understand the world that shaped him, the system designed to crush him, and the moment when everything changed. Wilkinson County, Mississippi in 1856 was one of the darkest places within the institution of slavery. Located in the southwestern part of the state near the Louisiana border, the county sat in what locals called the Black Belt. The name did not come from the people who worked the land, though they outnumbered white residents 5 to 1. It came from the rich, dark soil that made cotton grow endlessly wild. Enslaved people were worked to death and treated as replaceable tools. The Mississippi River curved along the western edge of the county, a shining symbol of escape that very few ever reached. Swamps and bayous cut through the land, filled with thick mud, snakes, and alligators, forming natural prisons that slaveholders used to keep people trapped. Riverside Plantation covered 3,000 acres of this violent landscape. Master Nathaniel Whitfield claimed ownership of everything there, the land, the cotton, the building, and the 143 human beings whose lives he controlled like livestock. Each year the plantation produced more than 200 bales of cotton. Every bale represented months of brutal labor under a burning sun, where overseers' whips tore open flesh. The entire county's economy depended on cotton, and cotton depended on black bodies, being worked until death and replaced by others bought at auction. The big house sat on a small rise, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns shining in the sun like bleached bones. Inside lived Master Whitfield, his wife Constance, their 3 spoiled children, and a rotating group of house slaves who lived in constant fear of being sold farther south to the even harsher sugar plantations of Louisiana. Behind the big house, hidden by magnolia trees, stood the overseer's cabin. It was home to a cruel Irishman named Seamus Ali, who believed enslaved people were animals who understood only pain. The slave quarters sat a quarter-mile away, made up of 28 rough wooden cabins, arranged in 2 long rows facing each other across a dirt path known as the street. Each cabin held 6 to 8 people, often with no family connection at all. Privacy did not exist. Dignity was a luxury no enslaved person could afford. The quarters smelled of sweat, illness, damp wood, and despair. Yet, on Sunday mornings when enslaved people were allowed a few hours to themselves, the air also carried something else. It carried hope, the stubborn scent of people refusing to die inside, even when everything around them worked to destroy them. This was the world Ezekiel Moore lived in. But it was not the world he was born into. Ezekiel was born in 1815, not on American soil, but aboard a slave ship named the Esperanza, meaning hope. A cruel joke for a vessel transporting 270 kidnapped Africans across the Mill Passage. His mother, Adisa, was an Ashanti griot from what is now Ghana, a gifted storyteller and keeper of history whose voice could hold an entire village silent for hours. She was 22 years old, pregnant and chained in the ship's dark hold when it left the Gold Coast. She gave birth to Ezekiel surrounded by death, in rough waters that nearly sank the ship. His first breath tasted of salt, blood, and human waste. The first sounds he heard were women screaming and sailors' whips cracking above him. Somehow, against all odds, both mother and child survived. They were sold together in Charleston, South Carolina, to a tobacco farmer named Jeremiah Haynes, a man who believed enslaved people worked better if you did not kill them too quickly. For 7 years, Adisa worked in the fields by day and raised her son by night. In whispers so soft even the walls could not hear, she taught him their people's history, the power of language, and the ancient skill of storytelling that could make listeners laugh, cry, burn with anger, or rise up. She taught him that words could be weapons, stories could protect, and memory itself was a form of resistance. She told him they might own his body, but they would never own his mind unless he allowed it. When Ezekiel was 7 years old, Haynes's tobacco farm collapsed. To pay his debts, Haynes sold everything, including Adisa and Ezekiel, but he sold them separately. Ezekiel never saw his mother again. He was into South, passed between 4 different owners over 8 years, moving deeper into cotton country each time until he arrived at Riverside Plantation in 1830. He was 15 years old and already empty inside. He survived by being useful, by causing no trouble, by smiling through beatings and saying yes, master, with a voice that almost sounded sincere. Everything shifted when Ezekiel was 17. An elderly enslaved man named Solomon, nearly 80 and no longer fit for field labor, noticed something special in him. Solomon had once been a preacher in Virginia before being sold south for preaching about Moses and freedom. Master Whitfield allowed Solomon to preach on Sundays, believing Christianity made enslaved people easier to control. Slaves, obey your masters, the Bible said, and white Christianity loved that verse. Solomon secretly taught Ezekiel to read using the only book they had, the Bible. Teaching slaves to read was illegal and punishable by brutal whipping, but Solomon was careful. Lessons took place in the woods by moonlight, using a Bible so worn the words were barely visible. Within a year, Ezekiel could read. Within 2 years, he could preach. When Solomon died of pneumonia in the winter of 1836, Ezekiel inherited his role as plantation preacher. Master Whitfield approved. A slave preacher was useful. Let them sing, pray, and dream of heaven, as long as they kept working, obeying, and dying quietly. For many years, Ezekiel delivered safe sermons. He quoted verses masters liked. He avoided Moses. He never spoke of freedom. Outwardly, he became exactly what the system wanted. Inwardly, something dangerous was growing. At 25, Ezekiel married Ruth, a field worker 3 years younger than him, with deep, thoughtful eyes and a singing voice so beautiful even the mockingbirds fell silent. Master Whitfield allowed the marriage, believing families reduced escape attempts. They lived in cabin 17, sharing the space with another couple and 4 children. There was no privacy, but love survived anyway. Ruth gave birth to their first daughter, Sarah, in 1841. Rebecca followed in 1843. And Mary in 1845. For the first time since childhood, Ezekiel felt something close to happiness. He had a family, he had purpose. He comforted the broken, baptized babies in the creek, knowing many would not live long, married couple whose unions meant nothing in law, and buried the dead in unmarked graves destined for forgetfulness. He convinced himself this was enough, that survival was victory, that keeping his family together was resistance. That hope, even false hope, was better than silence. Then March of 1856 came, and every lie Ezekiel told himself turned to dust. The winter of 1855 lingered heavily in the air, and the world he thought he understood was about to collapse. Bad luck and bad timing had crushed cotton prices. Master Whitfield, who took big risks and handled money carelessly, was now drowning in debt. He owed banks in Natchez. He owed merchants in Vicksburg. He owed fellow plantation owners, but his biggest debt was to Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy planter from the neighboring county. That debt came from a poker game that ended in disaster. Whitfield had bet $5,000 he did not have. He lost. Blackwood wanted his money. In early March, a slave trader named Silas Crow came to Riverside Plantation. Crow was feared across the region for his cruelty. He made his living buying enslaved people in the Upper South and selling them to the harsh sugar plantations of Louisiana, where most did not live long. Life that was counted in years, not decades. He traveled with armed guards, iron chains, and a reputation that made strong men tremble. At the sound of his name, Master Whitfield chose to settle his debt by selling slaves. Not just any slaves. Women of childbearing age and children brought the highest prices. Ezekiel's family fit that demand perfectly. It happened on a Sunday morning, March 9, 1856. Ezekiel was getting ready to preach the weekly sermon. Ruth and their daughter wore their best clothes, patched cotton dresses sewn from leftover scraps. Sarah was 14, already beautiful, already drawing dangerous attention from white men. Rebecca was 12, quiet and thoughtful. Mary was 10, still young enough to smile and laugh sometimes. Silas Crow's wagon came down the plantation road just as the slaves were gathering for church. Ezekiel saw it from the quarters and felt his stomach sink. Every enslaved person knew what that wagon meant. Iron cages mounted on wheels, chains hanging from the sides, clinking like a warning. Armed white men riding beside it, carrying rifles and whips. Master Whitfield stepped out of the big house with the overseer, O'Malley, beside him. He held papers in his hand, bills of sale. Ezekiel started walking toward them, fear rising like floodwater. He knew something terrible was coming, even if he did not yet understand what it was. Ruth. Master Whitfield's voice cracked across the quarters like a lash. Ruth and your 3 girls, come here. Time froze. The world shrank into a single moment of terror. Ruth looked at Ezekiel, her eyes asking a question he could not answer. The girls grabbed at her skirts. The other slaves fell silent, watching, already knowing, already afraid. Ezekiel ran. He ran toward his master, something slaves never did. They only ran away. Master Whitfield, sir, please. He fell to his knees in the dirt. Please, sir. Whatever I have done, punish me, not them. Please. Nathaniel Whitfield looked down at him with the same disgust one might show after stepping in filth. Get up, Ezekiel. This has nothing to do with you. This is business. I am selling your wife and daughters to Mr. Crow. They are going to Louisiana. Fine plantations. They will be treated well. Everyone knew that was a lie. Louisiana sugar plantations worked people to death, often within 5 years. The work was torture. But no one. He argued with a man holding legal papers. Please, Ezekiel begged again, tears running freely now. I will work harder. I will work nights. I will do anything. Do not take my family. Please, master. I have served you faithfully for 26 years. Exactly, Whitfield said coldly. 26 years. You know your place. You will survive this. Now step aside, or I will have O'Malley lay stripes on your back. Silas Crow stepped forward, chains clanking in his hands. He was thick-bodied, red-faced, with small, cruel eyes. Smart in a mean way. Move along, he said, into the wagon. Fight and you get whipped. Obey, and maybe you live long enough to see Louisiana. Sarah tried to run. One of Crow's men grabbed her by the hair and dragged her back as she screamed. Rebecca and Mary clung to Ruth. Ruth stood frozen, her face empty of tears. Grief so deep it had gone beyond crying. She looked like someone watching her whole life collapse. Ezekiel lunged toward her. O'Malley struck him across the head with the butt of a rifle. Ezekiel fell hard, the words spinning, blood and dirt filling his mouth. When he could see again, his wife and daughters were being chained together by the neck. 4 women linked like animals. Sarah fought and was beaten for it. Rebecca cried silently. Mary screamed for her father. Ruth began to sing a broken spiritual, her voice soft and shaking. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forward to carry me home. They pushed them into the iron cage. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked like a gunshot. Silas Crow climbed onto his horse, laughing with one of his men. The wagon began to move. Ruth pressed her face against the bars, looking back at Ezekiel. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Ezekiel tried to stand. O'Malley kicked him in the ribs. Stay down, preacher. Master says you can watch them leave. Consider it a lesson. So Ezekiel lay in the dirt and watched the wagon roll away. He watched it turn onto the main road. He watched it vanish behind the cypress trees. He stared until the dust settled and nothing remained. He stayed there for 3 hours until other slaves finally helped him up. He walked back to cabin 17 without speaking. The cabin that once held 5 people now held only 1. That night, in the dark, Ezekiel Moore, the obedient preacher, died. Something else was born in his place. Something cold, something focused, something devoted to one purpose. For 26 years he had preached patience. He had preached heaven and obedience and turning the other cheek. He had helped keep his people quiet with false hope. No more. If God was real, he was not coming to save them. If Moses existed, he was not coming either. Freedom would not be given. It would have to be taken not with prayers alone, but with fire, blood, and careful planning. That would shake the South awake in terror. Ezekiel made a promise in the darkness, not to God, not to spirits. To himself, he would destroy this system, or die trying. He would use the only weapon he had, his voice, his power to move people. He would light a fire that would burn through the South like judgment. He would preach sermons that sounded holy but were really battle plans. He would turn faith into action, songs into codes, churches into secret cells. And when the time was right, when the network was built and the people were ready, he would bring hell down, not just on Nathaniel Whitfield, but on the entire evil system that allowed children to be sold and suffering to be profit. He spoke the vow aloud, I will make them pay, all of them. I will burn their world to ash. I will free my people or die with them. I swear this on my wife and daughters, on my mother's bones, on everything I am. Amen. The word tasted like blood, smoke, and freedom. The next morning, Ezekiel went to Master Whitfield with a plan. He spoke calmly, humbly, like the loyal slave he pretended to be. Master, sir, I know you regret losing such valuable property, but I believe I can help you earn that money back if you allow me to travel to nearby plantations to preach. Other masters will pay for my services. I can be useful. Whitfield thought it over. Traveling slave preachers were common. They kept slaves obedient, and Whitfield needed money badly. Fine, he said. You may travel. Carry a pass at all times. Return every Sunday night. Cause trouble, and I will sell you to the first trader going west. Yes, master. Thank you, master. God bless you. Ezekiel walked out with a as that allowed him to move freely across Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. Whitfield believed he had found a way to profit from his preacher. What he had really done was give a revolutionary perfect cover. For the next 2 years and 7 months, Ezekiel lived 2 lives. By day, in front of white eyes, he was the harmless preacher, speaking of obedience and heaven. His words sounded submissive, but carried hidden meaning. By night, in hidden places, Ezekiel became something else. He preached in secret clearings, in cabins, in fields. His voice was low and urgent. His sermons were plans. His prayers were instructions. He studied people carefully. He found the strong ones, the angry ones, the brave ones, the ones already close to rebellion and only waiting for permission to act. He brought them in carefully, one at a time, tying them together with promises, vows, and a shared cause. He taught them how to spot one another using coded spiritual songs, certain hand signs, and specific ways of tying headscarves or wearing hats. He built a chain of rebels that spread across 3 states, all hidden in plain view, all waiting for one signal to rise at the same moment and strike together. His sermons became famous in whispers. Enslaved people walked for miles in secret just to hear him speak. Ezekiel had learned from his mother, the griot, how to use his voice, rhythm, repetition, and feeling to push people toward action. He always began softly, almost like casual talk. A Bible story everyone already knew. Slowly his voice would climb, growing stronger, beating with rhythm like a heart. He moved through the crowd, locking eyes, letting them see the fire burning inside him. His hands shaped the air, underlining every word. By the end he was shouting, crying, laughing, and the people were on their feet, ready to break walls, ready to die for freedom. Still, he never spoke of violence plainly. He was too careful for that. Instead, he used stories from the Bible, chosen with purpose, and explained in a very specific way. He preached about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, but he focused on the plagues, on the punishment God poured onto the oppressors, on Pharaoh's army drowning in the Red Sea. And the Lord said, "Let my people go." When Pharaoh refused, God answered with blood, fire, and death. The oppressor's children died. The oppressor's soldiers drowned. The oppressor lost everything, and the people walked free into the promised land. He preached about David and Goliath, but he stressed that David killed the giant, that faith demanded action, that God stands with those who pick up stones and aim true. David was only a shepherd boy, just one small man, but he did not pray for the giant to fall on his own. He chose a stone, swung the sling, and struck Goliath dead. Then all of Israel rose up and crushed their enemies. One brave man began it all. He preached about Samson tearing down the temple, about Judith cutting off Holofernes' head, about Jael driving a tent stake through a sleepy general's skull. He told every violent story of liberation in Scripture, always calling it ancient history, always wrapping it in spiritual meaning, but making sure his listeners understood the truth beneath it. God stands with the oppressed, blesses those who fight for freedom, and promises that tyrants will fall. Between the Bible stories, Ezekiel slipped in real knowledge. When the North Star stands highest in winter, rivers freeze hard enough to cross. Bloodhounds lose a trail in running water, or when red pepper is scattered on the ground. Overseers sleep the deepest between 2 and 4 in the morning. A sharp blade to the throat stops a man before he can cry out. He never said these things straight. He hid them inside parables, songs, and prayers, but the people understood. He also taught spiritual songs that worked as secret messages. Steal away meant a hidden meeting was coming. Wade in the water meant follow the creek to escape pursuit. Follow the drinking gourd meant follow the North Star. Go down Moses meant rebellion was near. Every song held layers of meaning, and Ezekiel's network learned to hear which verses he stressed, which lines he repeated, which tunes he altered. Month by month, plantation by plantation, Ezekiel built his force. He chose leaders at each place, trusted men and women who would act when the signal came. He set up hidden supply spots where stolen weapons were stored, axes, sickles, knives. Tools that could become tools of freedom. He marked escape paths, found safe houses run by free black people, and friendly Quakers linked his people to the Underground Railroad. Then he picked a date, October 14th, 1858, a Thursday night with no moon after harvests were done and many overseers would be drunk, celebrate another profitable year, while the weather stayed warm enough to survive outside if escape was needed. He chose 3 main targets. Riverside Plantation in Mississippi, where his own nightmare had started. Oakwood Plantation in Alabama, where he had seen an overseer assault a 12-year-old girl and face no punishment. Magnolia Grove in South Carolina, where a master sold a woman's baby because its crying annoyed him. These 3 plantations would burn. Their masters, overseers, and grown male family members would die. The enslaved people would be given a choice: flee north on the Underground Railroad or stay and defend the seized plantations as free communities. Either way, the South would wake to a horror it could no longer ignore. Ezekiel was not reckless. He knew 3 plantations burning at once would bring a huge military response, so he planned distractions. That same night, smaller uprisings would happen at 7 other places. Fires would be lit, masters threatened, confusion spread, pulling patrols and militias in many directions. By the time white authorities figured out which attacks truly mattered, the main strikes would be finished and his people would be gone, some heading north, others blending back into slave life as if nothing had happened. It was smart. It was bold. It was almost impossible. But Ezekiel had spent 2 years preparing, and he believed with deep religious faith that it would succeed. In the weeks before October 14th, Ezekiel made his final visits. He went to every plantation one last time, checking readiness, strengthening resolve, reminding leaders of their duties. He preached his strongest sermons yet, leaving people crying and ready to die for freedom. At Riverside Plantation, he chose 12 trusted men and women. He selected them with care, strong field hands filled with anger, a blacksmith who could shape weapons, a cook who could move freely in the big house, a young man whose brother had been sold south and never heard from again. Each had been crushed by the system and rebuilt by Ezekiel's vision. Each had sworn on blood and bone to finish this. The Riverside plan was simple and brutal. On the night of October 14th, while Master Whitfield held his monthly poker game with 3 other plantation owners, Ezekiel's group would act. The cook would poison the brandy. When the men began to feel sick, armed slaves would rush in and end it. Overseer O'Malley would be attacked in his cabin. Drivers who helped the oppressors would be executed. The big house would burn. By sunrise, Riverside Plantation would be free land, and its former slaves would be moving north. Similar plans existed in Alabama. Ma and South Carolina, each shaped to local conditions, each led by coordinators Ezekiel had trained himself. On October 13th, the day before the uprising, Ezekiel made peace with dying. He knew his chances of living were small. He knew that even if the rebellion worked at first, the white military response would be crushing. He understood he would likely die within days or weeks. He accepted it. Death was better than slavery. Death in the fight for freedom was victory. He spent that last day visiting the slave graveyard. He stood over the unmarked place where Solomon, his teacher, lay buried. He whispered that tomorrow they would do what Solomon always dreamed of: rise up, fight back, free themselves, or die trying. He went to the place where he had last seen Ruth and their daughters, where the trader's wagon carried his heart away. He spoke as if they could hear him. He told them he failed to save them, failed to protect them, failed as a husband and father, but he would not fail as a man. Tomorrow he would make the world pay for them, for everyone. He said he loved them, that he was sorry, and that he would join them soon. That night, alone in cabin 17, Ezekiel wrote a letter. He could not send it. Slaves were not allowed to mail letters. Still, he wrote, pouring out everything he had never said, explaining why what was about to happen had to happen, leaving a record he hoped would survive him. He wrote about his mother, teaching him that words could be weapons. He wrote about Solomon, teaching him to read. He wrote about Ruth and their daughters. He wrote about every cruelty he had seen in 43 years of bondage. And he wrote this: to whoever reads this after I am gone, know that we are human. We feel pain. We love our families. We dream of freedom. We will no longer accept a system that treats us like animals. Tomorrow we rise, not because we hate white people, but because we love freedom more than we fear death. If you are black and reading this in the future, remember that your ancestors fought back. We did not accept our chains. We resisted. We died fighting. Honor us by finishing what we began. If you are white and reading this, understand that this blood is on your hands. Every lash, every family torn apart, every child sold, every assault, every murder. This is your inheritance. You built a nation on our pain. We are tearing it down. May God have mercy on your souls, because we will not. He folded the letter, hid it in a crack in the cabin wall, and spent his last night before the uprising doing something he had not done in years. He prayed not for victory, not for life, but for courage, for his people, for a world where no child would be born in chains, where no mother would watch her baby sold, where no man would be forced to choose between obedience and death. Lord, he whispered into the dark, if you are listening, if you are real, if you care at all about justice, then tomorrow let our chains break, let our people go, and if we must die for freedom, let us die well. Amen. The word amen tasted of smoke and blood and revolution. October 14th, 1858, dawned clear and cool over Wilkinson County, Mississippi. The air smelled of cotton ready for harvest and the last flowers of autumn. Mockingbirds sang in the magnolia trees stood nearby. The Mississippi River moved past without care, just as it had for thousands of years, untouched by human pain. Ezekiel woke before the sun, as he always did. He put on his preacher clothes, plain pants, and a shirt, both mended many times but still clean. He slipped his handwritten pass into his pocket. He walked to the shared well and washed his face with cold water, looking at himself in the reflection. The man staring back was 43 years old, but he looked closer to 60. Years of hard work, bad food, and constant pressure had carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes. His hair was turning gray. His hands were rough, cracked, and marked with scars. But his eyes were full of fire and purpose. He spent the morning acting as if everything was normal. He worked in the plantation carpentry shop, fixing broken tools, keeping his head low, and avoiding any serious talk. Inside his chest, his heart beat hard and fast. Tonight everything would change. Tonight was the end of waiting. At noon, one of his coordinators, a field hand named Isaac, who had lost 3 children to slave traders, walked up to him. Pretending to look at a hammer, Isaac spoke softly. Everett, Hing is ready. The others know. We move at midnight. Ezekiel gave a small nod. Midnight. May God be with us. God. Isaac gave a dry, bitter smile. God left us a long time ago, preacher. This is on us now. Yes, maybe, Ezekiel said quietly. Or maybe we are the answer to our own prayers. The day dragged on like an injured animal. Ezekiel forced himself to eat dinner, even though his stomach twisted. He went to the evening prayer service that overseer O'Malley demanded, bowing his head and saying amen, while imagining Omali's blood soaking into the dirt. Afterward, he returned to cabin 17 and waited for night to fall. His thoughts ran through the plan again and again, looking for mistakes, preparing for the many things that could go wrong. At Riverside Plantation, the plan was simple. Master Whitfield had invited 3 other plantation owners for his regular poker night: Cornelius Hampton, Theodore Blackwood, and William Penton. All 4 men would be in the study of the big house, drinking, smoking cigars, and gambling with money earned through black suffering. At 11 o'clock, Dinah the cook would serve them poisoned brandy. The poison came from foxglove plants picked in the woods and prepared with care. It would not kill them right away. That would look suspicious. Instead, it would make them weak, dizzy, and confused, easy to overpower. At midnight, Ezekiel and 11 others would enter the big house. They would carry axes, knives, hammers, sickles, everyday tools found on any plantation, weapons that would not look strange if seen earlier. They would kill the 4 masters quickly and without cruelty. Then they would go to Overseer O'Malley's cottage and do the same. The drivers who worked with the oppressors, 3 men who beat other slaves to please white men, would be handled by others who had personal reason to face them. Justice would belong to everyone. After the killings, they would burn the big house, destroy ownership records, open the food stores, and give every enslaved person a choice. They could flee north using the Underground Railroad, or they could stay and defend the land as a free community for as long as they could. Similar actions would happen at the same time in Alabama and South Carolina. By morning, the South would wake to chaos, and slavery would suffer a blow it could not ignore. That was the plan. Simple, frightening, violent, and necessary. At 10 o'clock, Ezekiel left cabin 17 for the final time. He carried only a small Bible, Solomon's Bible, old and treasured, and a long knife hidden beneath his shirt. He walked through the quarters, nodding at people, seeing fear, hope, and resolve in their eyes. Everyone felt that something was coming, even if they did not know exactly what. Secrecy meant survival. He met his 11 coordinators in the shadows behind the carpentry shop. They wore dark clothes, their faces hidden in the night. Ezekiel knew them by shape and breath. Isaac the field hand, Dinah the cook, Solomon the blacksmith, 8th named after Ezekiel's mentor, Judith the weaver, Aaron the stable hand, and Moses the ox driver, whose name always carried heavy meaning. Sarah the laundress, named for Ezekiel's daughter, which made his chest tight. Benjamin the cooper, Ruth the midwife, another wound to his heart. Elijah the gardener, and 2 young men, barely 20, Josiah and Samuel, who had already lost everything to the system. Ezekiel looked at the 11 faces he could barely see and felt a deep, overwhelming love. They were about to kill men. They would likely die for it. And still they stood there because freedom mattered more than life. You all know the plan, he whispered. Dinah serves the poison at 11. We go in at midnight. Fast and clean. No cruelty. No games. We are not like them. We are fighting for freedom. After tonight, the world will never be the same. Are you ready? 11 voices whispered back that they were ready. Then let's go to war. They moved through the darkness like spirits separate, and taking their places around the big house and O'Malley's cottage. Ezekiel, Isaac, Solomon the blacksmith, and Moses waited behind the magnolia trees facing the study window. They saw the lamplight, heard laughter, smelled cigar smoke. The masters were celebrating another year of profit built on human misery at exactly 11. They watched Dinah enter the study with a silver tray holding a crystal bottle and 4 glasses. Even from outside, Ezekiel could see her hands shaking. She was 52 years old and had worked in that kitchen for 34 years. Master Whitfield had raped her when she was 16, and she had given birth to a child he sold away. Tonight, she was ending her part in his story. She poured the brandy. Master Whitfield lifted his glass to cotton gentlemen and to the ones who pick it. The men laughed and drank deeply. Dinah curtsied and left. Her task was done. Now came the hardest part. Waiting. Foxglove took 20 to 30 minutes to work. Too early, and the men would still be strong. Too late. They might die before facing justice directly. Timing mattered more than anything. Ezekiel took out Solomon's Bible and read by starlight, his lips moving silently. He did not read gentle verses. He read Exodus. The Lord is a man of war. He read Ecclesiastes. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. He read the law of punishment. Eye for eye, wound for wound. The Bible, Ezekiel knew, was full of violence when read honestly. God drowned armies. God ordered destruction. God struck down the firstborn of Egypt. God was not only mercy and love, sometimes God was judgment and fire. Tonight, Ezekiel believed they were the tools of that judgment. At 11:20, they heard trouble inside. A cough, a glass breaking, confused voices, someone asking if another was all right, complaints of dizziness, racing hearts, fear. Perfect. The poison was working. Ezekiel looked at the others. Now they moved quickly and quietly. Solomon had loosened the hinges on the back door earlier, and it opened without sound. They slipped inside, weapons ready, hearts pounding. The house smelled of wax, tobacco, expensive perfume, and suffering. Portraits of Whitfield's ancestors watched from the walls. Furniture worth more than human lives shone under the lamps. This wealth was built on stolen bodies and stolen years. They passed through the kitchen and down the hall toward the study. The men inside were weak now, their voices shaking. They spoke of not being able to breathe. They begged for doctors. They cried that they were dying. Ezekiel pushed open the study door. 4 white men stared at him. Their confusion turned to terror in an instant. Cards were scattered across the table. Glasses lay tipped over. Whitfield clutched his chest, pale and soaked in sweat. Hampton had vomited down his fine suit. Blackwood lay on the floor, gasping. Penton tried to stand but collapsed. They saw the knife. They saw the men behind Ezekiel. They understood. Ezekiel. Whitfield croaked, "What is this? What have you done?" Ezekiel stepped forward, calm and steady. "This is justice. This is payment for crimes that can never be forgiven, for my wife and daughters, for every whip, every family torn apart, every child sold, for 26 years of my chains, for 230 to 9 years of ours. This is what you owe. You're making a mistake," Whitfield said. "They'll kill you all for this, I know," Ezekiel answered. "But we will die free, and you will die first." He crossed the room in 3 steps. Whitfield tried to raise his hands, but the poison had taken his strength. Ezekiel grabbed his throat, looked straight into his eyes, and spoke. "This is for Ruth, for Sarah, for Rebecca, for Mary, for my mother Ada's, for Solomon, for every soul you bought and sold." He drove the knife into Whitfield's heart. The blade slipped between ribs and pierced the muscle. Whitfield's eyes widened. Blood bubbled from his mouth. He made a sound like a long breath, and then the light left his eyes, and Ezekiel held him for a brief moment, feeling the body grow still, feeling something inside himself break and reshape at the same time. A line had been crossed, one that could never be erased. He had taken a life, and in doing so had stepped into freedom. He lowered Whitfield's body to the floor, removed the knife, and turned toward the other 3 men. They were pleading now, offering money, papers, promises, anything they could think of. Their voices blended together in fear and desperation. Ezekiel looked at Isaac, Solomon, and Moses. These men before them had stolen lives, destroyed families, and committed cruelty beyond measure. Justice required an answer. What must be done must be done. What followed lasted only minutes, yet felt endless. Isaac moved toward Cornelius Hampton, a man known for trading hundreds of human beings and boasting of his cruelty. Isaac raised his axe and ended Hampton's life in a sigh-ingly decisive strike. It was quick, far kinder than Hampton had ever been to anyone. Solomon approached Theodore Blackwood, infamous for working enslaved people until they collapsed and replacing them without a second thought. Blackwood was unable to resist. Solomon lifted the hammer he had used all his life in forced labor and brought it down until the man no longer moved. Moses walked toward William Peton, who had treated human beings like property and torn families apart for profit. Peton begged for mercy, calling on God. Moses looked at him calmly and said that mercy should have been remembered long before cruelty became his way of life. With one clean motion, it was over. The room fell silent. 4 powerful men lay dead, their authority gone, their wealth meaningless. Ezekiel felt no joy, no sorrow, only a cold certainty. This was justice. It was harsh, imperfect, but necessary. He ordered the room burned, and the ownership records gathered and destroyed. Names, ledgers, and chains of paper were fed to the flames. They moved next to the overseer's cottage. Shemus Ali sat outside, drinking, careless and confident. He shouted orders when he saw them approach, reaching for his whip. He never had the chance to use it. Benjamin, whose family had suffered deeply under Ali's cruelty, struck first. The group surrounded the overseer. Ruth, the midwife, stepped forward and spoke of the people Ali had beaten, sold, and destroyed. She reminded him of every life he had treated as worthless. Then she ended his suffering and his power forever. Elsewhere on the plantation, 3 slave drivers who had enforced cruelty on their own people were dealt with swiftly. Their actions had earned them no mercy. Their bodies were left behind as a warning that betrayal would no longer be tolerated. By midnight, Every white authority figure on Riverside Plantation was gone. The main house burned brightly, flames rising into the night sky. Weapons were taken, papers destroyed. Nothing remained of the old order. Ezekiel rang the bell that once called people to forced labor. Now it called them to something new. 139 enslaved men, women, and children stepped out into the open, frightened, confused, and hopeful. They saw the fire. They understood. Standing high, Ezekiel spoke with a voice shaped by years of faith and planning. He told them the truth. They were free, but freedom came with a choice. They could leave immediately and follow guides north to safety, to places where the law no longer claimed them as property. Or they could stay, defend the land, and build something new, knowing soldiers would come. Some asked if others had risen too. Ezekiel smiled and told them the truth. This was not alone. Across states, the same fire had begun. This was not a single rebellion. It was the beginning of something larger. 60 people chose to leave that night. Families, elders, the sick. Ezekiel blessed them and watched them disappear into the dark. 79 chose to stay. They prepared as best they could, using tools and courage, knowing the cost. As the fire burned behind him, Ezekiel faced them and spoke again. He told them that freedom once tasted could never be taken away, that even if death came, they had already won something no one could undo. A young man asked for one last sermon. Ezekiel opened a worn Bible and spoke of Moses, of deliverance, of chains broken and seas parted. He reminded them they were human, that they felt pain, love, and hope, and that no lie could erase that truth. The people answered with tears, with raised hands, with voices finally unchained. Whatever dawn would bring, the night had already changed history. Power of his own word, turning 239 years of slavery into one final roar of defiance. And when we die, and some of us will die, we die with our heads held high. We die with blood on our hands. We die having felt the taste of freedom. We die having struck back. We die as warriors, not as slaves. We die as humans, not as beasts. We die free. The crowd erupted. People were dancing, singing spirituals, embracing each other tightly. Some prayed, some wept, some laughed, with that wild joy that comes from facing death and choosing it on your own terms. Ezekiel closed the Bible and looked at his people, no longer slaves now. Free men and women who had chosen liberation instead of mere survival. He loved them with all his heart. He knew many would die in the coming days, but they would die having truly lived for the first time. The night passed in both preparation and celebration. They sang spirituals until their voices were hoarse. They ate food from the big house stores, ham, cheese, and bread that had long been forbidden to them. They drank the master's wine. They wore the master's clothes. They slept for one night in the big house bedrooms on soft mattresses instead of dirt floors. Ezekiel spent that night writing letters to Ruth and his daughters, though there was no way to send them, to his mother, though she had long passed, and to Solomon, though he lay buried in the slave cemetery. He wrote his testimony, his reasons, his defense. He wrote, "We are not murderers. We are freedom fighters. We did not start this war. We are finishing it." As dawn approached, Ezekiel stood on the porch and watched the sun rise over Riverside Plantation for the last time. The big house was a smoking ruin. The quarters were empty except for his 79 fighters. The fields stretched endlessly, green and waiting for workers who would never come again. It was beautiful. At 7 in the morning, a neighboring plantation owner named Gerald Simpson rode up the main road with 2 overseers, likely coming to collect a gambling debt or borrow some tools. They saw the burned big house, saw armed black people on the porch, saw bodies in the yard, and understood immediately what had happened. Simpson turned his horse and rode like hell back down the road, shouting insurrection, slave revolt, Riverside has fallen, sound the alarm. Within 2 hours, bells were ringing across Wilkinson County. Within 4 hours, militia companies were forming. Within 6 hours, 300 armed white men surrounded Riverside Plantation, accompanied by packs of bloodhounds, cannons, and murderous intent. The siege had begun. Ezekiel stood behind a barricade made of furniture and cotton bales, staring at the army array. Against them, 300 men with rifles and artillery against 79 people armed with tools and 3 guns. It was not a battle. It was an execution waiting to happen. But they had one card left to play. Ezekiel raised a white flag, a bedsheet tied to a stick, and walked forward to negotiate. A militia captain, a young man named Thaddeus Kent, with a ridiculous mustache and eyes full of hate, rode out to meet him. "You, the leader of this rebellion, boy." Kent's voice dripped with contempt. "I am Ezekiel Moore. I led this uprising, "And I am not your boy," Ezekiel replied firmly. Kent laughed. "You're a dead man walking. That's what you are, you and all those behind you. Surrender now, maybe we'll spare some of them. Resist, and we kill every last one." Ezekiel met his gaze steadily. "We will not surrender. We are free now. We would rather die free than live as slaves." Kent sneered. "Then you'll all die, and we'll make it slow." Ezekiel nodded. "I expected nothing less from men like you. But before you attack, hear this, Captain Kent. This is not just one plantation. Right now, as we speak, similar rebellions are erupting in Alabama and South Carolina. Plantations are burning. Masters are dying. Your system is crumbling. You can kill us, but you cannot kill the idea. Freedom spreads like fire, and we have lit that fire." Kent's face went pale. "You're lying." "Am I? Why don't you send riders to check?" "Go ahead. We'll wait." Kent wheeled his horse around and galloped back to his commanders. Ezekiel watched as messengers rode out in different directions, then turned back to his people, expecting a bullet in the back. But then, one came. Not yet. 3 hours later, the messengers returned, and their reports confirmed Ezekiel's claims. Oakwood Plantation, Alabama had been seized by its slaves, 17 white men dead. Magnolia Grove in South Carolina was burning, 23 white men dead. Minor uprisings at 7 other locations. Panic had spread across the South. Captain Kent rode forward again, fury and fear written on his face. "You've started a war you can't win, boy, I know," Ezekiel replied calmly. "But we have proven something important. We can fight. We are not helpless. We are not animals. We are human beings who refuse to die in chains. Remember that, Captain. Remember us, because more will follow. This does not end here." "You are right about one thing," Kent snarled. "This doesn't end here. It ends with all of you swinging from trees." He turned his horse and gave the order. "Artillery, open fire." The cannons roared. The siege of Riverside Plantation lasted 6 hours. 79 people with improvised weapons fought against 300 trained militia with artillery. The outcome was never in doubt, but the enslaved fighters made them pay for every inch. They fought from behind barricades. They fought from windows. They fought hand-to-hand when the militia breached the defenses. They killed 19 white men and wounded 47 more before being overwhelmed. Some died from bullets, some from cannon fire, some from bayonets. Some fought to their last breath, screaming spirituals as they were gunned. Ned down. Ezekiel Moore survived the initial assault. He was captured alive with 12 others, specifically to be made examples. Captain Kent wanted them hanged publicly, so other slaves could see what happened to rebels. They were chained and paraded through Natchez, through Vicksburg, through Jackson. Crowds gathered to spit, curse, and call them animals and murderers. But some enslaved people watching from the edges of the road looked at Ezekiel and his companion with something different: respect, pride, hope. The trial was a mockery lasting 2 hours. The verdict had been decided before it began. Guilty of insurrection, murder, and arson. Sentence, death by hanging. Execution scheduled for November 5, 1858. Ezekiel spent his final 3 weeks in a cell in Natchez. A minister visited, trying to make him repent, to confess, to beg God's forgiveness. Ezekiel refused. "I have nothing to repent for," he said. "I freed my people. I struck back at evil. If God condemns me for that, then God is not just, and I want nothing to do with him." The minister left, scandalized. Ezekiel received one other visitor, an abolitionist newspaper editor from the North, William Lloyd Garrison, who risked his life to interview the condemned leader. Garrison smuggled in paper and pencil. Ezekiel spent his last days writing his full testimony, documenting his reasons, the methods used, and the philosophy behind the rebellion. He wrote about his mother, Solomon, Ruth, and his daughters. He wrote about the system of slavery and why it had to be destroyed. He wrote the truth. Garrison smuggled the document out and published it in the Liberator. It spread across the North, fueling the abolitionist movement. It proved that enslaved people were not passive victims but active resistors. On November 5, 1858, Ezekiel Moore and 12 others were hanged in the public square in Natchez. Thousands came to watch. The condemned were allowed to speak before the hanging. Most refused, but Ezekiel stepped forward and gave one final sermon. His voice carried strong and clear despite his chains. "I am Ezekiel Moore. I am 43 years old. I was born free in Africa and stolen into slavery in America. I have been beaten, whipped, starved, and broken. They sold my wife and children. They tried to crush my spirit. They tried to turn me into an animal. They failed." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hang him." Ezekiel's voice rose. I stand guilty of killing 4 plantation owners, 1 overseer, and 3 slave drivers. I organized rebellions across 3 states. I burned plantations. I freed slaves, and I regret nothing. The crowd roared with anger. God's moved to silence him, but Ezekiel continued shouting, Now you can hang me. You can hang us all, but you cannot hang the idea of freedom. You cannot hang the truth that chains can be broken. You cannot hang the proof that we are human beings who refuse to die as slaves. They forced the noose around his neck. He looked one last time at the crowd and saw enslaved people in the back, forced to watch as a warning. He locked eyes with them and smiled. His final words before the trapdoor opened. Remember me. Tell your children. The preacher fought. The prophet lived free. Finish what we started. Freedom or death. The trapdoor opened. Ezekiel Moore dropped. His neck snapped instantly, which was a mercy compared to what the system usually allowed. But his words lived on. In the following days and weeks, the South descended into paranoid madness. Slave patrols tripled. Laws became even harsher. Reading was punishable by death. Gatherings of more than 3 slaves were illegal. Preaching required white supervision. Yet beneath the oppression, something had changed. Slaves whispered Ezekiel's name like a prayer. They sang spirituals that told his story. They told their children about the preacher who had dared to defy the chains, and about the fire of freedom that could never be put out. Punctuation became a prophet, the man who proved that freedom was possible, the one who showed that the system could be challenged. In the year that followed, 3 more uprisings erupted, each inspired directly by Ezekiel's courage. None of them won on the battlefield, but each confirmed the same truth. Enslaved people would never simply accept their chains forever. The movement to end slavery grew rapidly in the North. Ezekiel's account, published by Garrison, convinced thousands that slavery could not be fixed, it had to be completely destroyed. Contributions to the Underground Railroad soared. Free black people organized armed groups to defend themselves. White abolitionists grew even more radical in their demands. In the South, the ground began to shift beneath their feet. They knew deep down, even if they would never admit it, that their system was weakening. It would take a full-scale civil war to finally destroy it. But men like Ezekiel Moore had delivered. The first strikes. 3 years after Ezekiel was executed in 1858. In 1861, the Civil War began. When the Emancipation Proclamation was declared in 1863, abolitionists remembered Ezekiel Moore and others who had risked everything for freedom when most people stayed silent. When the 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1865, the descendants of the Riverside Rebellion celebrated their ancestor who had shown that the impossible could be achieved. Ezekiel Moore died in 1858, but his legacy lived on. It lived on in every enslaved person who escaped through the Underground Railroad, in every black soldier who fought in the Union Army, in every freedman who cast a vote after the war, in every child who grew up free rather than in bondage. White historians tried to erase his story, preferring to claim that enslaved people were passive, obedient, or incapable of organized resistance. But his story survived in black oral traditions, in spiritual songs, in family stories handed down through generations. And it survives today in records like this one, testimonies that show humans will always resist oppression, that freedom is always worth fighting for, and that even in the darkest systems, people rise to challenge injustice. Ezekiel Moore was a husband, a father, a preacher, a revolutionary, and a prophet. He was also a human being who refused to die as a slave. His life mattered. His defiance mattered. His sacrifice mattered. Remember him. Remember what he fought for. Remember what he proved. That faith without action is empty. But faith combined with courage can bring liberation. The South tried to erase his story, but we are unearthing it. We are retelling it. We are making certain that Ezekiel Moore and the 79 who died with him are not forgotten, because their fight is far from over. Slavery may have ended in 1865, but its legacies persist in mass incarceration, in police violence, in economic inequality, and in systemic racism that still claims black lives while the world watches. The struggle Ezekiel began continues today in new forms. We honor him by carrying on that fight, by refusing to accept injustice, by speaking truth to power, by remembering that freedom is never freely given, it is seized. Ezekiel Moore, remember that name. Speak it aloud. Tell someone else. Ensure the prophet who no one could silence is finally heard. If this story moved you, angered you, or made you think, share it. Leave a comment. Engage with this history because the system that killed Ezekiel depends on our forgetting. Remembering is resistance. Telling his story is rebellion. What would you have done if you were in Ezekiel's place? What would you give for freedom? What would you risk for justice? These are not empty questions, they are real challenges. Because oppression is not gone, injustice continues. And the question Ezekiel posed in 1858 still demands an answer today. Will you fight for freedom, or will you accept your chains? The prophet spoke. Are you listening?